Greetings. Last week I talked about different careers, and there was a fellow who wanted to be a pet groomer. He wanted to be a pet groomer, but he couldn't make heads or tails of it. There was another person who wanted to be a musician, but after a while it turned out that he wanted to be a musician, but his career was not noteworthy. Hope you like those. Hope you like those. Anyway, if not, I'll try to do better next week. I want to make some comments about what I talked about last week. I talked about a plague that hit the ancient Israelites in the wilderness for their sinning, and it mentions in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 8. It says, "Nor let us commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell." And I mentioned that the total was 24,000. So 23,000 fell in one day. And now when you go back to Numbers, the 25th chapter, you find in the ninth verse, and those who died in the plague were 24,000. So that was a total overall. 23,000 in one day, 24,000 overall. I also want to mention that I talked about how a donkey talked to Balaam in a human voice. And one time I misspoke and said animal. Obviously, the miracle was the donkey talked in a human voice. It was a female donkey. And the term for man can also be used for man in general. Anthropos could mean a human being. And one last comment I want to make about last week. So I would encourage you to go ahead and see last week's if you haven't. But one last comment I want to make. I quoted a very powerful prophecy in Numbers 24:17, but the last part of that is one that commentators kind of struggle with. So at the end of Numbers 24:17, I would hope in future talks to talk more about that. Today, I want to speak about no exceptions. No exceptions. People think that because of their status, that maybe they can get away with more than the average person somehow because of their status, because of their position. That they can kind of bend the rules or even maybe break them and somehow not be held accountable because of their status. No, it's the very opposite. If you're in a position of leadership, if you have status and standing, then you need to be an example to others. And there's a saying, a fish stinks from the head. That the corruption often begins with the leadership, and then it filters down to others. They hear about what the leaders are up to, and it kind of gives them license. Or sometimes people get disillusioned. Here's a person who's supposed to be a leader, and this is how that person behaves, and so they get disillusioned and cynical. And in some cases, it could lead them to self-destructive behavior. What does Paul say in 1 Corinthians 11? He says, imitate me just as I also imitate Christ. So if you're in a position of responsibility, especially ecclesiastically, but even in a secular position, but if you're in a position of responsibility, or if you're, a prominent person in a sense, one who others are going to admire and look up to, then you need to be setting that example. But particularly within the church, if you're in an ecclesiastical position, you shouldn't think you can take liberties that the person in your congregation couldn't take. The opposite. You need to be possibly more careful than the average person in your congregation because people are looking to you for an example. Paul himself says in 1 Corinthians 9:27, "But I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified." If you're preaching to others, you certainly want to maintain your standard in your own life. And King David spoke about this because he he had a significant failure of which he had to repent and be forgiven. But I want to go to 2 Samuel 23. Near the end of his life, this wonderful person who unfortunately had that severe issue, that sin that cost him a lot. But fortunately, it didn't cost him his future, but it gave him a very painful life. But anyway, now these are the last words of David, 2 Samuel 23. Thus says David, the son of Jesse, thus says the man raised up on high, the anointed of the God of Jacob, and the sweet psalmist of Israel. So let's listen. The Spirit of the Lord spoke by me, and his word was on my tongue. The God of Israel said, the rock of Israel spoke to me. He who rules over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God. Very important that people in leadership positions, particularly within the church, maintain that standard. And don't think that they're exceptions because they're, VIPs. No. In fact, it's the opposite. You're more accountable in a way. And in fact, you'll hear that later on, God willing. I want to go to Psalm 82, the Tuesday Psalm. And Psalm 82 is where Jesus Christ quoted in John 10 on Hanukkah as an implicit condemnation of the spiritual leaders of his day. I want to go to Psalm 82, and I go to the 6th verse. Psalm 82, verse 6. I said, you are gods. You are the powers of this world. In some cases, in certain religions, when religion and state are combined, religious leaders have a life and death power over people. And certainly nowadays, secular rulers have a life and death power over people. I said, you are gods, and all of you are children of the Most High, but you shall die like men. God allows you to be in these positions or put you there, but you're human like anybody else. You're mortal like anybody else. But you shall die like men and fall like one of the princes. They come and they go. They live and they die. So you're just a human being. You're gods in one sense, but remember that you're human beings, really. And you have to act accordingly. You have to act in such a way that you're worthy of the position that you've been given. And finally, the prayer for people is that God himself would intervene in human affairs, and ultimately our rulers would be spirit beings in the millennium, Jesus Christ, and then the saints under him, as we see in the 8th verse of this passage. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all nations. Now, Samuel was a very important person in biblical history. The Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, the law, the prophets, and the writings contained the 1st and 2nd Samuel in the prophetic section. I want to go to Acts, the 3rd chapter, and here you see the importance of Samuel. Am I in Acts 3? In Acts 3, in verse 24, yes, and all the prophets from Samuel and those who follow, as many as have spoken, have also foretold these days. So he is one of the prophets. And notice he's put up there with Moses and Aaron in terms of the impact that he has historically. I want to go to Psalm 99. The 99th Psalm, and in verse 6, Moses and Aaron were among his priests, and Samuel was among those who called upon his name. So Samuel's right up there with Moses and Aaron, and I believe that Samuel very possibly added a section to the book of Deuteronomy because it was so critically important that he felt he had the authority and actually added a section that became part of the book of Deuteronomy. You don't have to agree with me on that, but we'll get there in just a minute. You know, in 1 Samuel 8, they demanded of Samuel, give us a king. And it bothered him, of course, but God said, it's not your fault. That's just the way they are. So go ahead and give them a king, but warn them what a king is going to do. You know, warn them about what it's like to be under a monarch, which he did, and they still wanted a king. So God made certain regulations regarding a king. And then Samuel went ahead and anointed a king, and critically, since Saul was ultimately rejected, he anointed David. And David, of course, becomes the ancestor of the Messiah. But it's interesting, Samuel's warning about what it's like to be under a monarch was utilized by Thomas Paine I'm speaking in America, and we celebrated our 250th year of independence, and Tom Paine wrote Common Sense, and in there he quoted out of 1 Samuel 8, the dangers of being under a monarchy. But in any case, later on, God said, I'm going to choose your king, and ultimately we had the Davidic monarchy, and the Davidic monarchy is going to survive. Jesus Christ is a descendant of David, and he's going to be king over all the world, and a resurrected David will rule under him. But when Israel decided to opt for monarchy, in Deuteronomy 17, there were regulations concerning that, and I want to go there now. The king, first of all, needed to become an expert in the law of the country. Now, I don't know how many of our presidents were really that familiar with the Constitution. Hopefully they were, but they have anyway people around them who are. They have assistants who serve them, who know the Constitution back and forth, hopefully, and can give them advice on those matters. But the king of Israel had to be an expert himself on the laws of the country. It was a theocracy. It was supposed to be ruled by the Torah, and the king himself was supposed to copy the Torah for a standard take a standard copy that the priests and Levites were preserving in the temple, and then copy it for himself. I want to go to Deuteronomy 17 and talking. This, of course, is an expansion of the, honor your father and your mother. Here we're talking about the secular father and mother, the rulers of the nation. And verse 14, when you come to the land which the Lord your God is giving you, and possess it and dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, you shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses. One from among your brethren you shall set as king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you who is not your brother. So that's one thing he tells them to do. And he goes on, but he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. For the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. So don't get overly involved with Egypt, because Egypt was a very powerful civilization, but in many cases, a very negative one. And so the Israelites were not to get particularly involved with Egypt. You'll see why I'm mentioning that. Well, I read it, but there's a reason I'm getting into that too. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. So don't get too wealthy, and don't get, where you want to have a harem like pagan rulers do. Also it shall be, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write for himself a copy of this law in a book, from the one before the priests, the Levites. And that might take as much as, let's say you're spending an hour a day on that, on copying the entire Torah. Back in ancient times, you don't have the facilities we have now. You're using a quill, I suppose, but anyway, you're taking an hour a day to copy the law. It would take maybe between 2 and 4 years to do it, but your administration could last 14 to 16 years if you're the average king. You're a king and you become an adult, you take over the throne, and then you keep it until you die, theoretically. So you've taken time to copy it. Now you can spend the rest of your life living by the law, as it says. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, and to be careful to observe all the words of this law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted above his brethren. You see that problem? Lord Acton, way back in more modern times, made a very brilliant comment, right? I think he's the one that said, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That is a principle you can find, you can derive from Scripture. That his heart may not be lifted above his brethren, that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right hand or to the left, and that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel, because it's supposed to be a dynasty, and you want it to be successful. So here are regulations regarding a king. Now you already know where I'm going with this. The greatest of the Israelite kings was, of course, Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon. And King Solomon was evidently quite young when he took over the throne. And at that point, he was humble and realized that the greatest thing he needed was wisdom. And so we go to 1 Kings 3, and that's what he prayed for. He prayed for wisdom. And let me go to 1 Kings 3. Now he had already, very brilliantly on one level, he had developed an alliance with Egypt, which would have been a great power of that day. And of course, Israel eventually became a regional superpower under Solomon. But this was it had already become a power under David, but he even expanded it. But one thing he did was he married a princess of Egypt, as it says here in 1 Kings 3. 1 Kings 3, the first verse. Now Solomon made a treaty with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married Pharaoh's daughter. Then he brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall all around Jerusalem. He did a lot of building. He accomplished a lot. Now I'm not sure this was the wisest thing, but he did that before he prayed for wisdom. So let's say it was politically savvy maybe, but maybe not the wisest thing spiritually to get that involved with Egypt. Now, there's a lot of wisdom that Egypt had, and Solomon gathered the wise sayings of the Egyptian wise men, and it was included in the book of Proverbs. A lot of Proverbs evidently is paralleled in the writings of the ancient Egyptians as well. But he probably gathered Proverbs from all around, as well. Of course, he had his own, and we'll get to that in a moment. But anyway, here Solomon is praying, and at Gibeon, in verse 5, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, ask what I shall give you. And Solomon said, you have shown great mercy to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in truth and righteousness and in uprightness of heart with you. You have continued this great kindness for him, and you have given him a son to sit on his throne as it is this day. Now, Lord my God, verse 7, you have made your servant king instead of my father David, but I'm a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people, whom you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to be counted or numbered. Therefore, give to your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours? Beautiful, huh? And he wants to be the most effective ruler possible, following, in his father's footsteps, doing better even than his father for that matter. The speech pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. And then God said to him, because you have asked this thing, and have not asked long life for yourself, nor have asked riches for yourself, nor have asked the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern justice, behold, I have done according to your word. See, I have given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has not been anyone like you before you, nor shall any like you arise after you. By the way, go to James, the first chapter, the 5th verse. We need to pray for wisdom ourselves. That's something. If Solomon can pray for wisdom, so can we. And I have also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honors, so that there shall not be anyone like you among the kings all your days. So if you walk in my ways to keep my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. So this happened, and Solomon became very successful, but he frankly it seems to me, and I think it would seem to you, that he let that go to his head. And somehow he knew what to say and how to judge, but at the same time, he evidently at some point thought that he was a sort of an exception to the rule, that because he was such a great king and had such a relationship with God, that he could get away with things that others couldn't get away with. That's what it would seem anyway. He built up particularly the capital, and he he made the Israelites work very hard to build up the nation, and particularly the capital. But the northern tribes, they were north of the capital, and they weren't getting the same benefit as Judah to the south. And you notice in 1 Kings 12, after Solomon died, they didn't want to continue with that system. It was benefiting more the capital than the northern kingdom. And so they came to Rehoboam, Solomon's successor, and they said, I want to go to verse 1 Kings 12:4. Your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the burdensome service of your father and his heavy yoke, which he put on us, and we will serve you. But Rehoboam didn't do that because God had already decided he was going to punish Solomon, because as I said, Solomon was great, and Solomon was the wisest of the kings, and Israel prospered under him. But then he began to, over time, evidently, as I said, affected him negatively. Prosperity, a lot of prosperity can be the biggest challenge. If you look at Deuteronomy 8, if you're very successful and prosperous, you could also get to the point where you think too much of yourself. And evidently that's what happened with Solomon. But I want to go to 1 Kings 4, and it talks about the greatness of Solomon here. I want to go to verse 20. Now, see, ancient historians like to talk about the Phoenicians, but if you look at 1 Kings, Solomon had a relationship with the Phoenicians. At that time, Lebanon and Israel were allies, and the Phoenicians had a relationship with the Israelites. But the historians just want to talk about the Phoenicians. They don't want to talk about the Israelites. By now, most Americans realize that those who give you the news have a bias. Well, so do historians often have a bias. And so we might keep that in mind. But anyway, here it talks about Judah and Israel in verse 20, were as numerous as the sand of the sea in multitude, eating and drinking and rejoicing. Talks about Solomon's kingdom and his wealth, his power. Verse 25, it's almost a millennial type setting. And Judah and Israel dwelt safely, each man under his vine and his fig tree, from Dan as far as Beersheba, all the days of Solomon. But notice, Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. But he was warned not to do that in Deuteronomy 17. He was warned about getting too involved with Egypt. All right, he did that before the prayer. But now we see that he's got all these horses, and it goes on. I'm not gonna read all of that, but it says he was wise. And God gave Solomon wisdom, exceedingly great understanding, and largeness of heart, like the sand on the seashore. Thus Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the men of the east, and all the wisdom of Egypt. Pardon me. So as I said, he gathered wisdom, and we have the book of Proverbs. Now, from Proverbs 10:1 to Proverbs 22:16, we have 375 Proverbs of Solomon. Solomon's name in Hebrew numerically equals 375. And we have a section of Proverbs of Solomon, 375 Proverbs. Also in Proverbs 25, we have Proverbs that later on in history, in Hezekiah's time, were copied. So the book became even larger, I suppose, at that time. So Solomon had all these proverbs. He also wrote this beautiful romantic poetry that I hope husbands and wives are studying. The Song of Songs, the Song of Solomon. Pardon me. It reflects the great literature of ancient southern India, the people of ancient southern India and Sri Lanka. So you see the impact. Solomon, as you read about him, he interacted with the world of that age. He accomplished a lot, and he of course, we have canonical writings of his, but at the same time he made mistakes which he should have known better. And in verse 34 it says, and men of all nations from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom came to hear the wisdom of Solomon. But then as time goes on, he makes more mistakes. One mistake, a terrible mistake, was he decided he was going to have a huge harem. He's warned about that in Deuteronomy 17. But verse 1 Kings 11, in verse 1, but King Solomon loved many foreign women as well as the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites, from the nations of whom the Lord had said to the children of Israel, you shall not intermarry with them, nor will they with you. Surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love. Moreover, he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. He had 1,000 women, and that's probably why you can read in Ecclesiastes. What is the biblical ideal? What is the biblical model for marriage? One man, one woman for life. That's obvious from the Bible. One man, one woman for life. And here's what if that doesn't happen, you're not going to have a proper relationship with any of the women if you're polygamous. And I want to go to Ecclesiastes 7, and you'll see what Solomon says there. And I just gave you probably the reason why he says it. Imagine he had 700 wives, 300 concubines, and in Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 29, I'm going to go to verse 28, 7:28. Well, I'll have to go back. I'll go there. I'm going to go back to 27 first to get the context here. Here is what I have found, says the preacher, adding one thing to the other to find out the reason, which my soul still seeks but I cannot find. One man among 1,000 I have found, but a woman among all these I have not found. So he couldn't find one reliable woman among 1,000. Because the ideal of a marriage is one man, one woman for life. It's not polygamy. Fortunately, he did find one man he could trust. That's good. And so Ecclesiastes reflects Solomon at the end of his life, where he realizes, frankly, that he'd blown it. God tells him in 1 Kings 11, it tells him that. But I want to go a little bit further talking about the problems that he had. Verse 4. For it was so when Solomon was old that his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not fully follow the Lord as did his father David. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the hill that is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the people of Ammon. And he did likewise for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. They weren't necessarily nasty women. They might have been very sweet women, and that's why he wanted to make them happy. But he did wrong things, to make them happy, and self-destructive things. They didn't know any better, but he did. So the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned from the Lord God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice, and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods, but he did not keep what the Lord had commanded. God had appeared to him more than once. He had built a temple for God. God had appeared to him more than once, and or had communicated with him more than once, and still he went astray. And it's interesting. I want to go back to one other thought here that may indicate a little bit of how Solomon's problems developed. If you go to 1 Kings 6, talking about the temple, at the end of 1 Kings 6, and in the 11th year, in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, the house was finished, talking about the temple, and all its details and according to all its plans. So he was 7 years in building it. But now keep reading. But Solomon took 13 years to build his own house, so he finished all his house. 13 years on his house. Wow. So maybe this is some indication that he'd kind of gotten overly involved with just building up his wealth and his power, and in that of his country, but particularly his own, because he was the ruler of the country. And as I said, he said the right things. His teachings are here in the Bible, but at some point he began going off, and this is a warning to anybody in a position of authority to not let that cause you to think more of yourself than you should. To remember that you need to maintain the standard that you originally committed yourself to when you took that position. And so at the end of his life, it does seem that Solomon did repent. And so we have the book of Ecclesiastes, and he realizes, that all of these physical things that we might enjoy temporarily, ultimately it's just hevel. It's just vapor, vanity. The words I'm in Ecclesiastes now. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And it's a very cynical book, but realistic. And then at the end, it finishes vanity of Ecclesiastes 12:8. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity. And then there's finally an appendix that summarizes the point. What is the point? The point is to keep the spiritual primarily. Maintain that standard, and especially, as I said, if you're in a leadership position, that's very important. Or if you're a person that others look up to, if you're a parent, set the right example for your children, mothers and fathers. Verse 13 of Ecclesiastes 12. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. We are going to be accountable for the way we behave, and we're not necessarily going to get a pass because we've accomplished a lot. Obviously, God evaluates people case by case, and there are extenuating circumstances. Sometimes there are reasons why people do what they do, and God, of course, takes that into account. I want to cover another couple of principles before I finish, and I want to go to Leviticus 19 and verse 15. Here he says, here God tells us, you shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty. Either way, just maintain the standard, right? I'm adding that, but let me just read the verse. You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty. In righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. So, yes, there are circumstances you need to take into account, as you see in the Bible. But at the same time, there's a standard that should be maintained. Everybody's going to stand or fall based on God's word. And I want to go now to Deuteronomy, the 16th chapter. And as I said, the 17th chapter speaks about a monarch. The 16th chapter talks about judges in general. I want to go to 16 and I want verse 18 when I get there. Deuteronomy 16:18. You shall appoint judges and officers in all your gates, which the Lord your God gives you, according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with just judgment. You shall not pervert justice. You shall not show partiality, nor take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of the righteous. So be careful if you're in a position where you have to make judgments that you're not swayed inappropriately. Tzedek, tzedek tirdof. Justice, justice you shall pursue. It's said individually as if the whole country is a person. You shall follow what is altogether just. That's how it's translated into English here. That reminds me of something. I think I already said that. It was at the end of Numbers 24:17. There's a translation issue there that I hope to get to someday. But this is quite clear. Justice, justice you shall pursue. So it's translated. It's translated here. You shall follow what is altogether just, that you may live and inherit the land which the Lord your God is giving you. So other ways of behaving are self-destructive, and they're going to be ultimately ruin to the community, to you personally, and on a larger scale, if it's done by national rulers, it'll bring ruin to the nation ultimately. Are you with me? So the Bible stresses all through, that it is important to maintain the standard, whatever your status is. and to apply. Yes, you have to be careful how you apply the law, but at the same time, maintain the standard. And if you're in a position where people are going to be looking up to you, then you need to set the right example. And I want to finish up now by going to Luke the 12th chapter. So there are no exceptions. The fact that you're a VIP, and maybe in reality you are, but really in one sense, none of us are really. But in this world, there are VIPs. There are people who have a lot of power and influence, and some people do really well, and I'm happy for them. But they have to realize that just because they've done well, it doesn't make them so great that they can violate what God demands of them. We're all going to be judged, great or small, rich or poor, by God's word. And in Luke 12, there's a passage that a lot of you should be familiar with. In the 47th verse, it says, "And that servant who knew his master's will, and did not prepare himself or do according to his will, shall be beaten with many stripes." See, he knew his master's will. Let me go back over that. "And that servant who knew his master's will, and did not prepare himself or do according to his will, shall be beaten with many stripes. But he who did not know, yet committed things deserving of stripes, shall be beaten with few. For everyone to whom much is given, from him much will be required. And to whom much has been committed, of him they will ask the more." So, if anything, those who are in positions of responsibility need to be more careful with how they behave, not less careful. And in any case, all of us are going to be accountable to God for how we've lived according to his word. There are going to be ultimately no exceptions. All the best to you and yours.